They told you he was the ultimate European genius. They told you he was the embodiment of the Germanic spirit. Go into any music conservatory in London, Paris, or New York. Walk into the practice rooms. Look at the bust on the piano. You know the face. We all know the face. The wild, flowing mane of straight hair. The thin, aquiline nose. The alabaster skin, pale and brooding, furrowed in deep existential thought. This is the Beethoven of the textbooks. This is the Beethoven of the movies. This is the Beethoven of Schroeder in Peanuts. This image is so ingrained in the collective consciousness of the West that to question it feels like madness. It feels like heresy. But let's paint it plain. You're not looking at a man. You're looking at a brand. You're looking at a filter applied by a culture that could not reconcile its greatest artistic achievement with the face of the man who actually created it. They told you it was a portrait. It was a fabrication. They told you it was history. It was marketing. Let's start with the official narrative, the romantic hero. In 1820, a painter named Joseph Karl Stieler was commissioned to paint the definitive portrait of Ludwig van Beethoven. This is the image you see on Wikipedia today. In it, Beethoven looks like a god of the mountains. He is holding a red scarf. His skin is glowing with an inner porcelain light. His lips are thin and tight. His hair is a storm of gray, but it is distinctly European in texture. This painting became the template. It became the official version. It was copied, printed, sculpted, and distributed to every corner of the earth. It said to the world, "This is what genius looks like. Genius is white. Genius is German. But evidence never sleeps. Paint dries, paper fades, but the cast does not lie." Now ask yourself this. If the Stieler painting is the truth, why does the forensic evidence tell a completely different story? Let's put the painting away and look at the life mask. In 1812, 8 years before Stieler picked up his brush, a sculptor named Franz Klein convinced Beethoven to sit for a life mask. This wasn't an artistic interpretation. This was a mechanical process. Plaster was applied directly to his face. It hardened. It captured the pore structure, the bone density, the exact geometry of the skull. There is no bias in plaster. There is no racism in a mold. And when you look at the 1812 life mask, the German god vanishes. What do you see? You don't see the thin, pinched nose of the Stieler portrait. You see a broad, wide nose, flat at the bridge, flaring at the nostrils. You don't see the thin, tight lips. You see a wide, full mouth. You see a facial structure that anthropologists classify as negroid, or, at the very least, heavily mixed. The forehead is slanted back, not vertical. The jaw is protruding, not recessed. The man in the mask does not look like the man in the painting. The man in the mask looks like a man who would be stopped at the border of the very country that claims him as a national hero. Here is the math. You have two images. One is a subjective painting commissioned to sell sheet music to aristocratic Europe. The other is a literal impression of the man's face. Which one is the lie? And more importantly, why did they feel the need to lie? Let's look at the ledger of his contemporaries, the people who actually saw him, the people who drank coffee with him, argued with him, and watched him conduct. Did they describe a pale, Germanic hero? No. They described a man who stood out. They described a man who didn't fit. Gottfried Fischer, who lived in the same house as the Beethoven family in Bonn, wrote a manuscript describing Ludwig as a child. He didn't mince words. He described the boy as short, stocky, broad shoulders, short neck, round nose, blackish-brown complexion. Blackish-brown. Not tan, not swarthy. Blackish-brown. In the German of the time, the word used was often Moor, the Moor. This wasn't a one-off comment. It was a pattern. Prince Nicholas Esterházy, the patron of Joseph Haydn, famously referred to Haydn and Beethoven as the Moors. He didn't say it as a compliment. He said it to remind them of their place. It was a slur. The Moor. It meant North African. It meant dark. It meant other. Beethoven's own friends called him the Spaniard. Now pause. Why would you call a German man from the Rhineland the Spaniard? Unless, of course, he looked like the people from the Spanish Netherlands who had intermixed with the North African soldiers occupying the region. We will get to the bloodline in the next chapter, but stick with the visual. The Spaniard was a code. In the polite society of Vienna, you didn't call a genius the black man. You called him the Spaniard. It was a polite way of acknowledging his dark skin without shattering the social order. Frau Kartoffilus, a woman who knew him intimately, said simply, "He was so dark that people called him the Spaniol." The composer Carpani described him as having a dark and ruddy complexion. The receipts are everywhere. Every single primary description from his lifetime mentions his dark skin, his broad nose, his coarse, thick hair. Yet, as the 19th century rolled on, as the myth of the Aryan genius began to take shape, the descriptions changed. The biographers started to scrub. The painters started to lighten. The blackish-brown complexion became swarthy. Then, it became olive. Then, by the 20th century, it became ruddy. And finally, in the movies, it became white. This is not an accident. You don't erase a face by accident. You erase it by design. The thesis is simple. We aren't looking at a man. We are looking at a curated brand designed to fit a narrative of European supremacy. By the mid-1800s, Europe was colonizing Africa. They were building an ideology that said the African was incapable of higher thought, incapable of civilization, incapable of music. How could they justify the colonization of the Dark Continent if the greatest composer in their own history looked like the people they were enslaving? It was a glitch in the matrix. It was a contradiction that threatened the entire project of white superiority. So, they fixed it. They deployed the Steeler filter. They thinned the nose. They straightened the hair. They bleached the skin. They turned Ludwig van Beethoven, the blackish-brown boy from Bonn, into the white messiah of music. But a lie has a shelf life, and the plaster mask is sitting in a museum in Vienna, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Why does the mask look like a black man, while the painting looks like a white aristocrat? They told you music has no color. That is a lie. Music has a source, and when you steal the source, you have to repaint the face of the creator. They stole the rhythm. They stole the innovation. And then, they stole the man himself. But before we can understand the theft, we have to understand the origin. We have to go back before the fame, before the symphonies, before the mask. We have to go back to the source of the blood. We have to go to Flanders. Because to understand why they called him the Moor, you have to meet the mother. They told you he was German. They told you he was the sonic architect of the Aryan identity. But geography has a memory that nationalism cannot erase. To understand the man, you have to look at the map. And when you look at the map of Ludwig van Beethoven's bloodline, you don't land in the snowy forests of Prussia. You land in the mud and the marshes of Flanders. You land in a geopolitical blender where empires collided and gene pools mixed. Let's paint it plain. Ludwig van Beethoven was not German in the way the Nazis wanted him to be. His family came from the region that is now Belgium. Mechelen, Louvain, the Spanish Netherlands. Now pause. Read that name again. The Spanish Netherlands. For over 150 years, from the 1500s to the early 1700s, this region was occupied, ruled, and patrolled by the Spanish Empire. But who was the Spanish Empire? This is the part they don't teach. Spain had spent 700 years under Moorish rule, the Al-Andalus civilization. When the Spanish armies marched north to crush the Protestant rebellions in the Netherlands, they didn't just bring white men from Castile. They brought their entire imperial machine. Here is the math. The Duke of Alba marched into the Netherlands in 1567 with 10,000 soldiers. Over the decades, tens of thousands more followed. These regiments were filled with men of tawny complexion, men with North African DNA, men who were undeniably Moorish. They stayed. They garnered local wives. They fathered children. It was a demographic injection of melanin into the Flemish countryside that lasted for generations. Historians call this the black legend of the Spanish occupation. But for the people of Flanders, it wasn't a legend. It was their neighbors. It was their fathers. The Beethoven family emerged from this specific melting pot. They were not isolated in a bubble of purity. They were living in the epicenter of the Moorish Spanish occupation. This explains why, 2 centuries later, Ludwig's neighbors in Bonn looked at his dark skin, his broad nose, and his coal-black hair, and called him the Spaniard. It wasn't a metaphor for his temperament. It was a citation of his pedigree. It was the neighborhood acknowledging what the history books would later try to scrub. The boy had the blood of the occupation in his veins. Now, let's look at the name. The Van. There is a deception in the syllables. When you hear Beethoven, you think of von. You think of Otto von Bismarck. You think of nobility. You think of a distinct, preserved, aristocratic bloodline. But the receipts show a fraud. Beethoven's name is van Beethoven. In Flemish, van simply means from. It is a commoner's preposition. It means you are from the beet farms. It means you are from the dirt. It means you are peasantry. Why does this matter? Because in 1818, Beethoven got dragged into a custody battle for his nephew, Karl. The case went to the Landgericht, the court for the nobility. The judges assumed, because of his fame and the sound of his name, that he was of noble birth. They asked him for his papers. They asked for his proof of nobility. Beethoven couldn't produce them. He pointed to his head and his heart and said, "My nobility is here and here." The court was unimpressed. They threw the case down to the magistrate, the commoner's court. Here is the pivot. The court legally declared him a non-noble. He was a commoner. And in 18th century Europe, who had the mixed blood? Who had the tainted lineages? The commoners. The nobility obsessed over pedigree and purity. The peasantry absorbed the armies, the travelers, and the migrants. Being a Van, and not a Von, meant his bloodline was open to the world. It meant there was no firewall protecting him from the Moorish DNA of the Spanish Netherlands. He was a man of the people, in the most genetic sense of the word. Now, let's look at the mother, Maria Magdalena Keverich. The historians love to gloss over her. They tell you she was a woman of sorrow, a widow, a mother who lost children. But let's look at her file. She was born in Ehrenbreitstein, a village in the Rhineland. Like Flanders, the Rhineland was a corridor of soldiers and travelers. She was not a woman of status. She was the daughter of a head cook. She was a servant class. When Johann van Beethoven, Ludwig's father, wanted to marry her, his own mother protested. Why? Because Maria was a chambermaid? Or was it something else? Descriptions of Maria are scarce. History rarely records the faces of cooks' daughters, but the genetic output tells the story. She birthed a son who was described by everyone who saw him as dark. Genetics is not a lottery. It is a receipt. You do not get a blackish-brown child from 2 distinctively pale Germanic parents. It is biologically impossible. The Spanish phenotype was strong in the Rhineland. It was a known marker. Dark eyes, dark skin, thick hair. Maria carried this marker. Whether she was of direct Moorish descent or just carried the concentrated genes of the Spanish occupation is a detail, but the result is a fact. She passed that Spaniard look to her son. And what did the historians do? They ignored the mother. They focused on the drunk father, They focused on the abusive grandfather. They erased the womb that carried the evidence. They pretended that Ludwig sprang from the earth fully formed, a Germanic monolith. But look at the timeline. 1500s, 1700s. Spanish, Moorish occupation of Flanders and the Rhineland. 1746. Maria Magdalena Keverich is born in this corridor. 1770. Ludwig is born. 1780s. Neighbors describe Ludwig as the Moor. Do you see the line? It is straight. It is unbroken. There's no mystery here. There's only cause and effect. The bloodline of Flanders was not white. It was a bruised, mixed, occupied bloodline that carried the history of North African soldiers marching through Northern Europe. Beethoven was not a genetic anomaly. He was a historical inevitability. But to maintain the myth of white supremacy, they had to sever him from this history. They had to turn the Spaniard into the German. They had to make you believe that a man with a broad nose and swarthy skin was just tan from walking in the sun. They lied about the geography. They lied about the name. And they lied about the mother. But the evidence is piling up. We have the face, the mask. We have the location, Flanders. We have the genetic history, the Moors. Now, we need the witnesses. We need the people who looked him in the eye and wrote down what they saw. We are going to open the journals. We are going to read the letters that the biographers tried to burn. We have the mask. We have the map. Now we need the testimony. In a court of law, physical evidence is powerful, but eyewitness testimony is the nail in the coffin. And when it comes to Ludwig van Beethoven, the witnesses are screaming. They aren't whispering. They are describing a man who looks nothing like the white marble bust sitting in the Vienna Museum. Let's paint it plain. The people who actually saw him, the people who ate with him, fought with him, and lived next door to him, did not describe a Nordic god. They described a man of color. Let's open the first file. Frau Fischer, you can't get a better witness than the neighbor. The Fischer family lived in the same house as the Beethovens in Bonn, at Rheingasse 934. They shared walls. They shared the smell of cooking. They saw Ludwig grow from a boy into a man. Frau Fischer didn't have an agenda. She wasn't trying to sell a biography. She was just writing down what she saw. And what did she see? In her memoirs, saved for posterity in the Fischer manuscript, she describes the young Ludwig with brutal clarity. Short, stocky, broad shoulders, short neck, round nose, blackish-brown complexion. Stop. Read that again. Blackish-brown. She didn't use the word tanned. She didn't say sun-kissed. She used a specific descriptor for pigment that sits at the far end of the spectrum. In the German vernacular of the 18th century, describing a local boy as blackish-brown, Schwarzbraun, is a definitive racial marker. It identifies him as an other. If Beethoven were a white German with a summer tan, she would have said he was healthy or weathered. She didn't. She marked his skin color as his defining feature. Now ask yourself this. Why would a neighbor describe a white German boy as having a round nose and blackish-brown skin unless he actually had them? There is no motive to lie. There is only the motive to record. Let's look at the ledger of the aristocracy. Prince Nicholas Esterhazy. This man wasn't a neighbor. He was the establishment. He was the patron of Joseph. Haydn, the most famous composer in Europe before Beethoven. Beethoven was sent to study under Haydn. The relationship was tense. Haydn was the polished courtier. Beethoven was the rough outsider. But how did the prince refer to them? He had a nickname for Haydn and his new student. He called them the Moors. In 18th century Austria, Moor was not a term of endearment. It was a racial classification. It meant North African. It meant black. To call Haydn a Moor was a nod to his own swarthy complexion, another secret history for another day. But to lump Beethoven in with him? It was a confirmation of a shared phenotype. The prince looked at these two geniuses and saw the same thing. Dark skin, foreign features, non-European blood. He didn't call them the Germans. He didn't call them the masters. He called them by their skin. Let's pivot to the professionals. Giuseppe Carpani. Carpani was an Italian poet and writer, a man who knew the faces of Europe. He met Beethoven. He looked him in the eye. And when he wrote his description, he didn't reach for the adjectives of the Romantic poets. He reached for the facts. He described Beethoven's complexion as dark and ruddy. Dark, oscuro. Not fair. Not pale. Dark. Then consider Anton Schindler, Beethoven's own secretary. The man who arguably did the most to whitewash Beethoven's legacy, we'll get to his crimes in Chapter 8, still slipped up. In his early descriptions, before the narrative hardened, he admitted that Beethoven was known as the Spaniard, due to his dark complexion. Even Carl Czerny, the famous pianist and student of Beethoven, described his teacher's appearance in a way that shatters the myth. He compared Beethoven's complexion to Robinson Crusoe, wild, hairy, and dark. He noted the coal-black hair that stood up in a thick, unruly mane. This wasn't the silky, flowing hair of the 1820 paintings. This was texture. This was volume. This was hair that defied the comb of the European aristocrat. Here's the pattern. It is undeniable. Fischer, blackish-brown. Esterhazy, the Moor. Carpani, dark. Schindler, the Spaniard. Czerny, coal-black hair. Every single person who stood in a room with Ludwig van Beethoven noticed his melanin. It was his most striking physical trait. It was the first thing they wrote down. So, how did we get from blackish-brown to the snow-white busts in the museum? The erasure happened in the editing room. Later, biographers looked at these descriptions and panicked. They couldn't delete the words, so they redefined them. They told you that dark meant he had a dark temperament. They told you blackish-brown was a metaphor for his fiery personality. They told you the Spaniard was just a joke about his clothes. They gaslit history. They took literal physical descriptions and turned them into psychological metaphors. But the receipts don't care about metaphors. When Frau Fischer wrote round nose, she meant a round nose. When Prince Esterhazy said more, he meant more. You have to understand the visual landscape of Vienna in 1800. It was a white city, a very white city. A man with blackish-brown skin didn't blend in. He stuck out. He was hyper-visible. This is why the nickname stuck. This is why everyone commented on it. If Beethoven looked like the other Germans, his skin color would not have been a topic of conversation. You don't describe a fish as wet. You describe it when it's something unusual. The fact that everyone mentioned his darkness proves that his darkness was an anomaly in that space. This is the witness file. It is closed. The jury has heard the testimony. The neighbors, the princes, and the poets all agree. The man was not white, but visual evidence is just the surface. To truly understand the identity of Beethoven, we have to look at who he accepted as his kin. We have to look at the one man in Europe he treated as an equal, a man who looked just like him, a man whose name was erased from history just like Beethoven's face. History is written by the victors, but it is edited by the cowards. And nowhere is the edit more brutal, more obvious, and more heartbreaking than in the story of the Kreutzer Sonata. You know the piece. It is the Mount Everest of the violin repertoire. It is fiery, difficult, emotional, and violent. It is considered the ultimate test for a violinist. History tells you it was dedicated to Rodolphe Kreutzer, a French violinist. But history is lying. Rodolphe Kreutzer never played the piece. He hated it. He called it outrageously unintelligible. He went to his grave mocking the very music that immortalized his name. So, who was it written for? Who was the muse? It was written for a black man. Let's introduce the ghost in the room. George Augustus Polgreen Bridgetower. His father was West Indian, a servant to Prince Esterhazy, the same prince who called Beethoven the Moor. His mother was German-Polish. George was a prodigy, a virtuoso. He was Afro-European, visibly black, with thick curly hair and dark skin. He walked into the white salons of London, Paris, and Dresden, and he shredded their expectations. He didn't just play. He possessed the instrument. In 1803, Bridgetower arrived in Vienna. He met Beethoven, and it was electric. Now ask yourself this. Beethoven was notorious for his temper. He was grumpy, isolated, misanthropic. He hated the stiff aristocracy. He spat on social norms. Yet, when he met this black violinist from London, the walls came down instantly. Why? They spent days together. They drank together. They played together. Beethoven didn't just tolerate Bridgetower. He loved him. He saw a mirror. Here was another outsider, another man with dark skin and frizzy hair who possessed a genius that terrified the mediocrity around them. They were brothers in rhythm, two Moors in a city of porcelain dolls. Here is the receipt, the manuscript. We still have the original score of the sonata, number 9, Opern 47. Look at the handwriting. At the top of the page, in Beethoven's own scroll, it does not say Kreutzer. It says, Sonata per uno mulatico lunatico. Sonata for a crazy mulatto. Let's decode the language. Mulatto. In 1803, that is a loaded word. It defines race. It defines the other. But look at the context. Lunatico. Crazy. This isn't a slur hurled by an enemy. It's a joke cracked by a friend. It's the N-word pass of the 19th century. It is intimate. It is brotherly. It is code. Beethoven didn't write formal dedications like this for his white patrons. For Prince Lichnowsky or Archduke Rudolph, the language was stiff, subservient, formal. To his Imperial Highness. But for Bridgetower, it was raw. It was real. My crazy mulatto. It was an acknowledgement of their shared status on the fringe of Viennese society. Beethoven was signaling, I see you. You're like me. The premiere happened on May 24th, 1803, at the Augarten Theater. It was 8:00 a.m. The ink was still wet. They hadn't rehearsed the finale. Bridgetower had to sight-read the violin part over Beethoven's shoulder at the piano. In the middle of the performance, during the piano cadenza, Bridgetower did the unthinkable. He improvised. He mimicked a run Beethoven had just played on the piano. It was bold. It was jazz, before jazz existed. And what did Beethoven do? Did he stop? Did he scold him for ruining the structure? No. He jumped up from the piano bench. He ran over to Bridgetower. He hugged him in the middle of the stage. He shouted, "My dear boy, once more." That is the energy. That is the connection. It was spontaneous, rhythmic, African. It was the sound of the diaspora breaking through the rigid corset of classical music. So, how did Bridgetower disappear? The falling out. It is the oldest story in the book. A woman. A few months after the premiere, the two men were drinking. Bridgetower made an off-color remark about a woman Beethoven admired. Beethoven, whose temper was legendary and fragile, snapped. He felt betrayed. He flew into a rage. He took the manuscript. He scratched out Bridgetower's name. He erased the crazy mulatto. And in a fit of spite, he mailed the piece to Rodolphe Kreutzer in Paris, a man he barely knew, a white man who represented the establishment. Here is the math of the erasure. Kreutzer received the music. He looked at it. He saw the syncopation, the aggression, the polyrhythms. He didn't understand it. He said it was impossible to play. He shelved it. Yet, because his name was on the cover, history remembers the Kreutzer Sonata. Bridgetower? He was exiled from the narrative. He returned to England. He died in poverty in a small house in Peckham, buried in a graveyard that is now dragged over by urban development. Forgotten. This is the pivot. The erasure of George Bridgetower is the smoking gun for the erasure of Beethoven. Think about it. Bridgetower was visibly, undeniably black. His skin was too dark to hide. So, when he fell out of favor, the establishment couldn't whitewash him. They couldn't paint him pale. So they had to delete him. They removed his name. ignored his contribution, and buried his legacy. Beethoven was different. His skin was dark, yes. His nose was broad, yes. But he was just light enough to pass. He was just ambiguous enough to be fixed, with a little paint and a little propaganda. So, history made a choice. The black man they couldn't whitewash, Bridgetower, was erased from the record. The black man they could whitewash, Beethoven, was stripped of his melanin and exalted as a white god. It is two sides of the same coin. One lost his career, the other lost his identity. Bridgetower is the ghost that haunts the Beethoven myth. His existence proves that Beethoven operated in a multiracial world. His existence proves that Beethoven felt a kinship with Afro-Europeans. His existence proves that the masterpieces we revere were birthed in the energy of black collaboration, not white isolation. When you listen to the Kreutzer Sonata today, listen to the violin part. That isn't Rodolphe Kreutzer. That is George Bridgetower. That is the soul of a black virtuoso screaming to be heard from beneath the ink of the censor. But the connection goes deeper than just one friend. It goes into the music itself. They couldn't scrub the rhythm. In the next chapter, we're going to mute the history books and turn up the volume. We're going to listen to the syncopation. We're going to prove that Beethoven wasn't just black in body. He was black in sound. Paint dries. Canvas fades. Plaster cracks. But sound? Sound is a ghost that refuses to leave the room. You can whitewash a face. You can edit a biography. You can burn a letter. But you cannot scrub the rhythm out of a symphony. We have looked at the physical evidence. We have looked at the genetic map. Now, we must listen to the audio tape. Because if you close your eyes and ignore the marble bust on the piano, Ludwig van Beethoven does not sound like a German aristocrat. He sounds like the grandfather of jazz. He sounds like the diaspora. Let's paint it plain. 18th century European music was a cage. It was rigid. It was mathematical. It was the era of Haydn and Mozart. Think of a powdered wig. Think of a perfect garden. The music moved in predictable patterns. The waltz, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The march, 1, 2, 3, 4. The accent was always on the 1. It was safe. It was polite. It was white. Then came Beethoven, and he didn't just open the cage. He took a sledgehammer to the bars. He introduced something that terrified the Viennese elite: syncopation. Syncopation is the rebellion of the beat. It is the emphasis on the off beat. It is the rhythm of West Africa. It is the 2 and the 4. It is the heartbeat of the spiritual, the blues, and the ragtime that would explode a century later. Beethoven played with a rhythmic violence that had no precedent in Germany. He wasn't composing. He was drumming on the keys. Here is the math. Let's look at Piano Sonata, number 32, Opus 111. The second movement. This piece was written in 1822. Jazz would not be invented in New Orleans for another 80 years. Yet, listen to the variation in the middle of this sonata. It is not a minuet. It is boogie-woogie. I am not using that term loosely. I mean literal. Stride piano. Barrel house boogie-woogie. Musicologists have stared at this score for decades, scratching their heads. They call it the boogie-woogie variation. They treat it as a freak accident of genius, a coincidence. They tell you Beethoven just stumbled upon the exact rhythmic structure of 1920s Harlem by mistake. Stop. There are no accidents in a masterpiece. Beethoven fractured the time signature into 1232. He created a swinging triplet-heavy rhythm that drives forward with a kinetic, physical energy. If you played this track for a blindfolded listener and asked them to guess the composer, they wouldn't guess a deaf German man in 1822. They would guess Scott Joplin. They would guess Duke Ellington. Why? Because the swing is not European. The swing is African. It is the polyrhythmic retention of a man who feels time differently than his peers. Mozart floated. Beethoven swung. Now ask yourself this. Where did he get it? Did he learn it at the Vienna Conservatory? No. They taught counterpoint, not groove. Did he learn it from Haydn? No. Haydn taught structure, not soul. He pulled it from the blood. He pulled it from the same place he got his hair and his skin. This is what we call the polyrhythmic connection. In West African musical tradition, the one is not the king. The rhythm is communal. You have a 3-beat pattern moving against a 2-beat pattern. This friction creates a groove. It creates a tension that makes you want to move your body. European church music was designed to make you sit still and look up. African music was designed to make you stomp the ground. Beethoven's music is heavy on the stomp. Look at the Symphony No. 9. The scherzo, the timpani, the drums break out of the background. In Mozart's day, drums were polite punctuation. In Beethoven's Ninth, the drums are the lead singer. They are thunderous. They are tribal. He uses them to hammer out a rhythm that disrupts the melody. He forces the orchestra to fight against the percussion. This is an African aesthetic. It is the call and response between the drum and the string. Critics at the time didn't know how to handle it. They called his music barbaric. They called it wild. They called it uncivilized. Decode the language. Barbaric is a dog whistle. In the 19th century, civilized meant European rigidity. Barbaric meant African chaos. They were hearing the blackness in the notes, even if they refused to see it in the man. They felt the intrusion of a foreign spirit. Let's look at the ledger of influence. When jazz musicians in the 20th century began to study classical music, who did they gravitate toward? Not Bach, not Brahms. They went to Beethoven. Chuck Berry famously sang "Roll Over Beethoven," but he wasn't dismissing him. He was acknowledging him as the competition. The pioneers of jazz and blues recognized the syncopation. They recognized the blue notes, the minor thirds and sevenths that Beethoven used to create tension and agony in his music. The Germanic sound is major, triumphant, and resolved. The diasporic sound is minor, struggling, and unresolved. Beethoven's music is defined by struggle. It is the sound of a man banging his head against a wall. It is the blues, transposed onto a symphony orchestra. The historians want you to believe that Beethoven invented these rhythms out of a vacuum. They want you to believe that he was a musical scientist who discovered syncopation, like Newton discovered gravity. But that is the arrogance of the eraser. They assume that innovation can only come from the intellect, never from the heritage. They deny the possibility that Beethoven was tapping into a cultural memory, a sonic legacy passed down from the Spanish Netherlands, from the Moors, from the mother who stood in the kitchen in Bonn. The rhythm is the receipt. You can fake a painting, you can fake a genealogy chart, but you cannot fake the pocket. You either have it or you don't. And Ludwig van Beethoven had the pocket. He disrupted the 4/4 time signature of Europe with the 12/8 feeling of Africa. He didn't just change the music, he changed the way the world felt time. So we have the face, the mask. We have the blood, Flanders. We have the witness, the contemporaries. We have the friend, Bridge Tower. And we have the sound, the syncopation. The evidence is overwhelming. The man was not who they said he was. He was a black man creating the soundtrack of the Western world. But if the evidence is so loud, why is the silence so deafening? How did they manage to mute the truth for 200 years? This brings us to the crime. It wasn't enough to ignore his race. They had to actively destroy it. They had to build a machine to scrub him clean. You don't erase a man in a day. You do it stroke by stroke. You do it layer by layer. The whitening of Ludwig van Beethoven wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow-motion heist committed with oil paint and marble. They told you the portraits are historical records. That is a lie. The portraits are propaganda. If you line them up on a wall, chronologically, from 1800 to 1827, you are not watching a man age. You are watching a man mutate. You are watching a blackish-brown commoner from the Rhineland slowly transform into a Nordic god. Let's look at the timeline. Let's walk the gallery of deception. Exhibit A, the Steinhauser drawing, 1801. Beethoven is 30 years old. He is young. He is famous, but not yet a god. Look at the sketch. The nose is wide. The lips are thick. The hair is a dense, unruly mop of wool. The skin is shaded, dark. This matches the descriptions of Frau Fischer. This matches the Spaniard. The artist, Gandalf Steinhauser, wasn't trying to sell a myth. He was sketching a musician. Exhibit B, the Latran drawing, 1814, 13 years later. Louis Latran sits down with Beethoven. This is considered one of the most accurate likenesses because it was used for the 1812 life mask we analyzed in Chapter 1. Look closely. The features are heavy. The jaw is broad. The nose is flat at the bridge. There is no attempt to make him pretty. He looks like a man who has been in a fight. He looks heavy. He looks swarthy. Exhibit C, the pivot. Now, watch the shift. The year is 1815, the Congress of Vienna. Europe is redrawing its borders after Napoleon. Nationalism is rising. The concept of the German spirit is being born, and the German spirit cannot be represented by a Moor. Enter Joseph Karl Stieler. The year is 1820. Beethoven is deaf, famous, and legendary. Stieler is commissioned to paint the definitive portrait. And this is where the crime happens. Stieler didn't paint the man. He painted the idea. Look at the Stieler portrait. You know it well. It's the one on the coffee mug. It's the one on the poster. Where did the broad nose go? It has been pinched into a thin, aquiline blade. Where did the thick lips go? They have been tightened into a thin, straight line of determination. Where did the blackish-brown skin go? It has been bleached. He is glowing. He is alabaster. He is backlit by a storm, holding a red scarf, looking up into the heavens. This isn't journalism. This is a filter. This is the 19th century version of Photoshop. Stieler took the raw data of Beethoven's face and ran it through an Aryan algorithm. He stripped the ethnicity and left only the intensity. He colonized the canvas. Now ask yourself this. Why did Stieler do it? Was he a bad artist? No. He was a master. He did it because he was paid to produce a specific product. The Romantic genius. In the Romantic era, genius was defined by the sublime. It was about transcending the physical body. It was about spirit. And in the racial hierarchy of 19th century Europe, spirit was white. To depict Beethoven as he actually looked, dark, stocky, Moorish, would have grounded him in the mud. It would have made him primitive. It would have made him human. Stieler needed a demigod. So he painted one. Here is the math of the erasure. The Stieler portrait became the official source. It was copied by engravers. Those engravings were put into books. Those books were sent to schools. The Latran drawing, the Steinhauser sketch, they were filed away in archives. They became footnotes. By 1850, a child born in Berlin or London only saw the Stieler version. The lie had replaced the truth through sheer volume of distribution. This is how you hack history. You don't burn the old pictures. You just outprint them with the new ones. But the idealization didn't stop with paint. It moved to marble. Look at the bust by Klein, 1812, versus the bust by Max Klinger, 1902. Klein worked from the life mask. His bust looks ethnic. It looks real. Klinger's statue? It is a monument to delusion. It depicts Beethoven as Zeus, sitting on a throne, shirtless, with a literal eagle at his feet. His face is chiseled, angular, and purely Caucasian. This is 80 years after his death. The transition is complete. The man has been fully digested by the myth. This was the idealization movement. Art critics of the time argued that a portrait shouldn't show the accidents of nature, like a broad nose or dark skin. It should show the essential truth of the subject. And to them, the essential truth of Beethoven was that he was a great German man Therefore, he must look like a great German man. If the reality contradicted the ideology, the reality was the error. Let's look at the ledger. We have the descriptions from his friends calling him black. We have the life mask showing broad features. We have the early sketches showing a Spaniard. And then, suddenly, we have a white god. The timeline is the smoking gun. The whitening happens in direct correlation with his rise to fame. The more famous he got, the whiter he became. This wasn't just artistic license. It was theft. They stole his face. They looked at a man who carried the blood of Flanders and the Moors, and they carved him into a totem of white supremacy. They told the world, look what we did. But paint cracks. And if you look closely at the Steeler portrait today, you can see the desperation in the brushstrokes. You can see the effort it took to hide the truth. But hiding the face wasn't enough. They had to police the identity. They had to make it illegal to question the myth. Art is not just paint. It is politics. And history is not just memory. It is a weapon. By the late 19th century, the whitewashing of Beethoven's face was complete. The Steeler filter had done its job. But erasing a face is one thing. Erasing a soul takes an army. It takes a government. It takes a mandate. To understand why the evidence of Beethoven's blackness was buried so deep, you have to understand the machine that buried it. You have to look at the rise of German nationalism. Let's paint it plain. In the late 1800s, Germany was trying to invent itself. It was a patchwork of states trying to become an empire. To build an empire, you need a myth. You need a hero. You need a god. And in the German imagination, music was the new religion. They needed a high priest. They needed a figure who represented the absolute peak of German intellect, German will, and German purity. They chose Ludwig van Beethoven. But there was a problem. The high priest was a swarthy, broad-nosed man who was called the Moor by his own prince. He was a man whose grandfather was Flemish, whose mother was a cook's daughter from the Rhineland, and whose bloodline was soaked in the Spanish occupation. He didn't fit the suit. So, they tailored the man to fit the myth. This was Project Purity. Now ask yourself this. What happens when a cultural icon becomes a national security asset? The truth becomes treason. The Germanization began in the universities. It started with the redefining of words. Scholars looked at the descriptions of Beethoven's Moorish complexion and realized they had a crisis. If they admitted Moorish meant black or North African, the entire narrative of Aryan supremacy collapsed. So, they changed the dictionary. They argued that Moorish was merely a colloquialism for sun-tanned. They argued that blackish-brown meant weather-beaten. They argued that Negroid features was just a rude way of saying ugly. They stripped the racial markers of their biological meaning and turned them into metaphors. They destroyed the nuance to save the narrative. But the real crime happened when the Third Reich took the stage. The Nazis rise to power. Their entire ideology is built on the concept of the Übermensch, the Aryan Superman. They needed cultural proof that the Aryan race was the creator of all high culture. Beethoven became their Exhibit A. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, seized Beethoven. They played his Ninth Symphony at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. They played his music at Hitler's birthday parties. They declared him the sonic embodiment of the German spirit. Here's the math. If Beethoven is the perfect Aryan, then he cannot be black. It is a zero-sum game. To acknowledge even a drop of African blood in Beethoven's veins would be to admit that the Aryan ideal was a lie. It would be to admit that the master race was worshipping a Michelin, mixed-race person. So, the erasure became law. The Nazis controlled the museums. They controlled the history books. They controlled the music conservatories. Do you think a professor in 1938 Berlin was going to publish a paper titled Beethoven, the Afro-European Genius? No. That professor would be removed. That paper would be burned. The censorship wasn't just active, it was atmospheric. It became impossible to even think of Beethoven as anything other than white. They weaponized his genealogy. They emphasized the von, even though it was van. They forged a lineage of pure German peasant stock. They ignored the Spanish Netherlands. They ignored the Moorish soldiers. They ignored the receipts. They built a fortress of alternative facts around his family tree that stands to this day. But let's look at the ledger of the aftermath. The Nazis fell in 1945, but the narrative didn't fall with them. This is the tragedy. The Germanized Beethoven had become the global standard. The Americans, the British, the French, they all bought the myth. They kept the Steeler portrait. They kept the Aryan genius model. Why? Because the West still needed a white hero. Even after the war, the academic establishment refused to touch the Black Beethoven theory. They called it fringe. They called it Afrocentric revisionism. They dismissed it with a wave of the hand. But look closer. Who wrote the definitive biographies? Who curated the museums? Men who were trained in the very institutions that the nationalists had built. The destruction of nuance is the most effective tool of the eraser. They made it sound ridiculous to even suggest he was black. Oh, you think Beethoven was African? Next, you'll say the Queen of England is African. They used ridicule to silence the receipts. But the receipts are stubborn. The receipts are the life mask. The receipts are the letters to Bridge Tower. The receipts are the syncopation in the 30-second sonata. Project Purity was a success for 100 years. It successfully severed the man from his origins. It turned a messy, mixed, diverse reality into a sterile, white fantasy. It turned the Spaniard into the German. But empires fall, and lies rot. The project relies on you not looking at the dates. It relies on you not looking at the map of Flanders. It relies on you trusting the painting over the plaster. We have peeled back the paint. We have looked at the blood. We have listened to the rhythm. Now, we have to look at the men who held the pen, the biographers, the secretaries, the men who had access to the private conversations and chose to burn them. The crime wasn't just committed by the state. It was committed by the inner circle. It was an inside job. History relies on the scribe. If the man holding the pen decides to lie, the future inherits a fiction. And in the case of Ludwig van Beethoven, the man holding the pen wasn't just a liar. He was a vandal. Let's introduce the villain of the archive, Anton Schindler. Schindler was Beethoven's unpaid secretary in his final years. He was a sycophant, a hanger-on, a man desperate to attach his mediocrity to Beethoven's greatness. After Beethoven died in 1827, Schindler seized control of the legacy. He appointed himself the guardian of the image. But he didn't guard the truth. He curated it. Here is the math of the destruction. Beethoven was deaf. To communicate, he used conversation books. Visitors would write down their questions or comments, and Beethoven would answer verbally, or sometimes write back. These books were the unfiltered, raw record of his daily life. They contained the jokes, the insults, the political rants, and the racial observations of the people around him. There were approximately 400 conversation books when Beethoven died. By the time Schindler was done organizing the estate, there were only 136 left. Now ask yourself this. What happened to the other 264 books? Schindler burned them. He didn't lose them. He destroyed them. He later claimed they contained nothing of value. Let's paint it plain. You don't burn 60% of a genius's life record unless it contains something you don't want the world to see. What was in those books? Descriptions of his heritage? Comments about his illegitimate children? References to his Moorish identity? We will never know because the ash doesn't speak. But Schindler didn't just subtract. He added. He forged entries in the surviving books to make himself look better and to align Beethoven with the conservative, aristocratic image of Vienna. He literally wrote himself into history and wrote the Spaniard out. He sterilized the man. He created the St. Ludwig myth that Project Purity would later adopt. But Schindler was just the janitor. The architect of the academic erasure was an American. Enter Alexander Wheelock Thayer. In the mid-19th century, Thayer set out to write the definitive biography, the life of Ludwig van Beethoven. To this day, it is considered the Bible of Beethoven scholarship. If you study music history at Juilliard or Yale, you read Thayer. But Thayer had a problem. He was a Harvard man. He was writing for a white Victorian audience in America and Europe. He had access to the primary sources, the Fisher manuscript, the letters, the descriptions. He saw the words blackish brown. He saw the Moor. He saw the Spaniard. He couldn't ignore them. So, he reinterpreted them. Let's look at the ledger of translation. When Thayer encountered the description of Beethoven's dark skin, he didn't treat it as a biological fact. He treated it as a literary device. He argued that the darkness was a reflection of Beethoven's scowling face or his outdoor lifestyle. He codified the metaphor theory. He wrote that the Spaniard nickname was due to his dark complexion, but then immediately pivoted to emphasize his German lineage. He acknowledged the physical trait only to dismiss its racial implication. He separated the sign, skin color, from the signifier, race. This is the biographer's betrayal. It is the refusal to accept the simplest explanation. Occam's razor says, if everyone calls him black, he is probably black. Thayer's razor says, if everyone calls him black, they must mean he is a moody German genius. This book became the foundation. Every subsequent biography, from Solomon to Lockwood, built their house on Thayer's cracked foundation. They cited Thayer, not the primary sources. They cited the interpretation, not the evidence. It became an echo chamber of denial. And this brings us to the academic gatekeeping of today. Walk into a musicology department today. Raise your hand. Ask the professor, was Beethoven black? Watch the reaction. It won't be curiosity. It will be annoyance. It will be dismissal. They will call it fringe. They will call it pseudoscience. They will tell you that it doesn't matter because music is universal. Now ask yourself this. If it doesn't matter, why did they work so hard to paint him white? If race is irrelevant to music, why is the Steeler portrait the only one allowed on the syllabus? The gatekeepers protect the canon. The canon is white. To admit that the central pillar of that canon, the man who bridged the classical and romantic eras, was a man of color would require a complete restructuring of Western cultural identity. It would mean that the sound of Europe was actually the sound of the diaspora. They dismiss the theory because they cannot survive the implications. They demand DNA evidence, which we will discuss in the next chapter, while ignoring the mountains of documentary evidence. They hold the black theory to a standard of proof that they never applied to the white theory. They assumed he was white by default. We have to prove he was black beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden of proof is rigged. But the betrayal goes deeper than just books. It's about who gets to claim ownership of genius. Thayer and Schindler stole Beethoven from the world and locked him in a European cage. They cut him off from his Flemish roots, his Moorish blood, and his syncopated soul. They turned him into a statue. But statues don't bleed. And statues don't groove. The conversation books are gone. The letters are censored. The biography is compromised. But they couldn't burn the bones. They couldn't burn the hair. In the 21st century, forensic science has finally caught up to historical fraud. We don't need Anton Schindler's permission anymore. We have technology. We have anthropology. We have the physical remains of the man himself. Paper burns. Ink fades. Memories rot. But bone is the final witness. Bone is the immutable archive. When the biographers have finished scrubbing the paper trail and the painters have finished bleaching the canvas, the skeleton remains. It waits in the dark, holding the geometry of the truth. They told you science settled the debate. They told you the DNA proved he was European. They lied. Science is a tool, but the hand that holds the tool determines the result. And when it comes to Ludwig van Beethoven, the science is not a verdict. It is a battleground. Let's start with the geometry, the masks. We have two perfect 3D records of Beethoven's face. The 1812 life mask, taken when he was alive and vibrant, and the 1827 death mask, taken hours after he died. These aren't artistic interpretations. They are topographical maps. Forensic anthropologists look at these masks and see what the art historians refuse to see. They see prognathism. This is the scientific term for the protrusion of the lower jaw. It is a distinct skeletal trait often found in African populations. Look at the life mask again. The jaw juts forward, the forehead slopes back. The nasal bridge is low and wide. Here is the math. In 19th century anthropology, these features were catalogued. Scientists like Carlton Kuhn and others, using the racist but detailed metrics of their time, identified these specific cranial shapes as Negroid or non-European. Even the Nazis knew it. Why do you think they were so obsessed with measuring skulls? Because they knew that skull shape tells the lineage, and Beethoven's skull shape did not fit the Aryan template. It fit the Moorish template. Now ask yourself this. Why do the busts in the souvenir shops show a vertical forehead and a recessed jaw? Because they aren't based on the mask. They are based on the Steeler fantasy. The mask is the receipt. The bust is the forgery. Let's pivot to the bone fragments. In 1863, Beethoven's body was exhumed for study. It was a macabre scene. The Austrian government wanted to ensure the remains were secure. During this process, fragments of his skull were photographed and measured. The physician Gerhard von Breuning, who was present, described the skull bones. He noted their density. He noted their thickness. In the racial science of the 1800s, a dense, thick skull was frequently cited as a marker of African ancestry. While modern science has rightfully debunked the racial hierarchy attached to these metrics, the physical description remains a fact. His skeletal structure was robust, heavy, and distinct from the gracile, thinner skulls, typical of the Viennese population. The fragments told a story of a man who was genetically distinct from his neighbors, but those fragments were reburied, hidden away. The physical evidence was put back in the ground, leaving us with only the descriptions of the men who held them. Now, let's look at the ledger of the DNA stalemate. This is the modern weapon. In 2023, a study was published in Current Biology. The headline screamed, "Beethoven's DNA sequenced. He was European." The gatekeepers took a victory lap. They said the case was closed. They said the Black Beethoven theory was dead. But let's read the fine print. Let's look at the chain of custody. The DNA analysis was not performed on bones. It was not performed on teeth. It was performed on hair. Specifically, the Hiller lock. The story goes that a 15-year-old boy named Ferdinand Hiller cut a lock of hair from Beethoven's head the day after he died. This lock was passed down through generations, traveled across borders, was sold at auctions, and eventually ended up in a lab. Now ask yourself this. How do we know it's his hair? The study tested 8 locks of hair. 5 matched each other. 3 did not. One of the locks that didn't match was the famous Guevara lock, which for decades was worshipped as the true relic. It turned out to be from a woman. If the Guevara lock, which historians swore was authentic, was a fake, why are we trusting the Hiller lock? Here's the receipt. There is no unbroken chain of custody. There is no video footage of Hiller cutting the hair. We are relying on provenance, which is a fancy word for a story written on a piece of paper. In the 19th century, selling fake Beethoven hair was a cottage industry. It was the piece of the true cross for music lovers. The market was flooded with fakes. If you test a fake lock of hair from a random German man in 1827, guess what the DNA result will be? European. The study proves that the hair belonged to a European male. It does not prove that the hair belonged to the composer of the Ninth Symphony. It is a circular argument. They are using the result to prove the authenticity, and the authenticity to prove the result. And even if the hair is authentic, we run into the limitations of genetic ancestry testing. These tests compare markers against modern populations. They tell you who you look like today. They struggle to map the complex, messy, migratory gene pools of the 18th century Spanish Netherlands. They struggle to identify the specific Moorish markers that might have been diluted over 2 generations, but still presented physically in the phenotype. Science is not neutral. The questions you ask determine the answers you get. If you ask, does this hair look German? The algorithm looks for German markers. If you refuse to look for the North African markers, or if you use a reference database that is heavily European, you will get the answer you paid for. The DNA verdict is not a gavel slam. It is a PR stunt. It is an attempt to use the authority of the lab coat to silence the authority of the archive. They want you to look at a PDF of a genome sequence and ignore the descriptions of the people who actually saw him. They want you to trust a strand of hair found in an attic over the memoirs of his neighbors. The skull shape, the mask, says African influence. The eyewitnesses, the witness files, say African influence. The genealogy, Flanders, says African influence. The music, the syncopation, says African influence. Against all that, they hold up a single lock of hair with a questionable receipt and say, trust us. We don't trust. We verify. And until they exhume the body and test the femur, the bone that cannot be faked, the bone that holds the marrow of the truth, the DNA evidence is inadmissible. The ledger is still open. The science is incomplete. And the skull of Ludwig van Beethoven is still waiting in the central cemetery of Vienna, holding the final secret. But the tragedy isn't just about bones and blood. It's about what was stolen from the world. It's about the cultural theft. The trial is over. The evidence has been presented. We have the mask. We have the maps. We have the witnesses. We have the rhythm. But before we close the case file, we have to answer the question the defense always asks, the question that appears in every comment section, every classroom, and every dinner party when this topic comes up. Why does it matter? They tell you, music has no color. They tell you, genius transcends race. They tell you, Beethoven belongs to the world. So who cares what his melanin count was? Let's paint it plain. This argument is a luxury. It is a privilege enjoyed only by those whose history has never been erased. If music had no color, they wouldn't have spent 200 years painting him white. If race didn't matter, they wouldn't have changed blackish brown to ruddy. If it was irrelevant, they wouldn't have burned the conversation books. It matters because the lie was intentional. And you don't build a lie that big unless the truth is dangerous. Now ask yourself this. What is the cost of the theft? Here's the math of the theft of genius. When you tell a black child that their history is nothing but chains, cotton, and trauma, you are stealing their future. You are telling them that their ancestors were labor, not intellect. You are telling them that the great works, the symphonies, the philosophies, the cathedrals, were built by people who look nothing like them. But if you tell that same child that the man who wrote the Ode to Joy, the anthem of the European Union, was a man who looked like them, that changes the neural pathways. It shifts the center of gravity. It reclaims the owner's mindset. Beethoven represents the pinnacle of Western art. He is the summit. By bleaching him, the establishment claimed the summit for themselves. They declared that the highest emotional expression of the human soul is a European property. We are here to serve the eviction notice. We are here to repossess the asset. Let's look at the ledger of the outsider. For centuries, historians have framed Beethoven's anger, his isolation, and his rough manners as the eccentricities of a deaf genius. They called him a misanthrope. They said he was just difficult. But look at the ledger again through the lens of race. He was called the Moor. He was called the Spaniard. He was a dark-skinned commoner navigating the most rigid white aristocratic society on earth. When he was rejected by women like Magdalena Villman because he was ugly and half crazy, was it just his face? Or was it his race? When he was mocked by the princes for not knowing his place, was it just classism? Or was it racism? When he refused to bow to the nobility, was it just arrogance? Or was it the defiance of a man who knew he would never be accepted, no matter how well he played? The angry. Beethoven trope makes a lot more sense when you realize he was the original other. He wasn't just fighting deafness. He was fighting a society that consumed his talent, but rejected his personhood. He was the crazy mulatto in a room full of powdered wigs. His music wasn't just romantic. It was a protest. The smashing chords, the disrupted rhythms, the violent syncopation, that is the sound of a man banging on the glass ceiling. It is the sound of a man demanding to be seen, reclaiming the narrative. The final verdict is not that Beethoven was a black man who happened to write music. It is that his blackness, his heritage, his difference, his rhythm, was integral to the music he wrote. You cannot separate the syncopation of the 32nd Sonata from the blood of the diaspora. You cannot separate the struggle of the Fifth Symphony from the struggle of the Spaniard in Vienna. He didn't succeed because of Europe. He succeeded despite it. He took the forms of Haydn and Mozart, the forms of the oppressor, and he broke them. He injected them with a soul and a fire that Europe had never heard before. He didn't just join the canon, he conquered it. So, to the historians who hide the evidence, the statute of limitations on the truth has expired. To the teachers who teach the Steeler portrait, update your syllabus. To the gatekeepers who say it doesn't matter, it matters because the truth is the only thing that matters. We are not asking for permission to claim him. We are simply reading the receipts. He belongs to the lineage of the Moors. He belongs to the lineage of Flanders. He belongs to the lineage of the rhythm that traveled from Africa to Europe and changed the world. The closing receipt. Let's end with the man himself, not the myth, not the statue, the man. In 1806, Beethoven got into a fight with his patron, Prince Lichnowsky. The prince tried to force him to perform for French officers like a servant. Beethoven refused. He stormed out into the rain. He went home and smashed a bust of the prince. And then, he wrote a letter. Historians usually quote this letter to show his pride, but read it now. Read it knowing what you know about the Van, the Moor, and the Spaniard. Read it as a declaration of independence from a system that tried to own him. Prince, what you are by accident of birth. What I am of myself. There are and will be thousands of princes. There's only one Beethoven. He knew. He knew he didn't fit their bloodlines. He knew he didn't fit their hierarchy. He knew he was something else, something entirely his own. He was the Moor of Vienna, and he is finally coming home. Case closed.